Now, for the last 3 weeks or so, we have been using Micah chapter 6, verses 6 through 8, as kind of a doorway into prophets, into the message of these men and women of old who spoke to God's people. And we saw that the people often ask this question: what is it that God wants of me? What will satisfy you, God? What will make you happy? What will get you off my back, so to speak? And God responds to that question with that famous verse in Micah chapter 6, verse 8. What is it that the Lord requires of you? Except to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Now, last week, we talked about doing justice. But it's interesting that our focal text for this sermon series doesn't just urge us to do justice. It urges us to love kindness, was how the New American Standard Bible translated that verse, that word. The Hebrew word is chesed. You're going to hear that word a lot this morning. Sometimes it's translated in a wide variety of ways. We'll talk about that more in a moment. So what does it mean to love chesed? Why is that so important? That's what we want to dig into this morning. And, as you read that verse in English, even in English, you can see how God is raising the expectations of his people. It's not just about doing justice. It is about loving this thing called chesed. But when you do what we're going to do this morning, and you dig into this Hebrew word, and you see how it is exemplified in Ruth's story, that moral vision becomes grand indeed. So let's look first at the many faces of chesed. We've talked about this before in our worship services. There are lots of ways that this word can be translated. It can mean something like loyalty or fidelity. You stick with people. It can mean things like mercy or compassion or kindness. That's how the New International Version, which Natalia read for us this morning, repeatedly translates this word in Ruth. It can even be used for something like goodness, moral goodness. We saw how the New Century Version, last week we saw how the New Century Version uses that word goodness for mishpat, which is justice. But the word chesed, kindness or compassion or mercy or whatever you want to call it, can be used for that word goodness too. Now, why are we going through a Hebrew lesson here? What's the big deal with all of this? Well, the thing about translation is that sometimes a word doesn't come over from one language into another very well. Sometimes you really have to dig in to understand a concept. And this concept is so difficult to communicate in English that sometimes Bible translators or theologians will use a phrase like steadfast love for this word, chesed. And yet the linguists will tell you that this word really doesn't mean love, because there's a different Hebrew word for love. So what are we doing here? What is the Old Testament trying to communicate when it uses this word? I did a lot of thinking about that this week, a lot of praying about it. In fact, I've done a lot of thinking about it for years. And I do think there is one English word that will help us understand what we're talking about. So think about it. If there's one word in English that you can think about that means love but isn't love, what would it be? It would be devotion. This is Shiloh that I put up here on the screen for you. She's a sweet dog, and she loves her people. And, that's just kind of how dogs are, aren't they? And in fact, when one of her people leaves, she stands guard over the other one to make sure they're taken care of. That's why we love dogs. They're devoted. But there's a very serious point here. This notion of devotion really captures all of these many faces of chesed and draws them together. And the thing is, that's what we see in the story of Ruth. Now sometimes, simply speaking conceptually doesn't really cut it, right? You can talk in abstract terms all you want about something, and some of us are still going to have trouble understanding, right? It's just the way our brains are wired. But we can tell a story, and we can see how something is embodied, how something is lived out, and it makes more sense to us. That's why the story of Ruth is so valuable. Our word, chesed, repeatedly occurs within the book of Ruth. And it gives us a touch point within this story. But the story itself is what illustrates what God wants from his people. So let's unpack that story a little bit, okay? So, if you're looking there in chapter 1 of Ruth, okay, it starts by sort of setting up this story. You got this guy named Elimelech, okay? Now, his name means God is my king, all right? And his family lives in Bethlehem. The name of the town is House of Bread. So a guy named God is my king lives with his family in a place called House of Bread. Well, the problem is there's a famine in this place called House of Bread. Well, that's not supposed to be, right? So this guy named God is my king picks up his family and moves out of House of Bread, moves to this place called Moab. Now, Moab is not in the land that God had promised to the Hebrew people. He leaves his divinely promised inheritance. We can understand why. There's a famine. I don't know about you, but when I get hungry, that motivates me to do lots of things. Things I might not otherwise want to do. And he wasn't just hungry like, we'll be hungry after church. He and his wife and his sons were really hungry. So they moved to Moab. Something that really they probably weren't supposed to do. And he gets to Moab, starts living there. Well, then Elimelech, this guy named God is my king, dies. So now his wife, Naomi, we'll talk about her name in a second, she is left there just with her sons. But her sons are basically grown, so she gets them wives. Well, the problem is that her sons are named Mahlon and Chilion, which means something to the effect of weakness and sickness. So can you guess what happens to them? They die. Now, Ruth, or I should say Naomi, is left with these two daughters-in-law that she cannot provide for. In a foreign land, by the way, where she has no family, where she has no inherent rights or no social system to support her, right? Just at this time, Naomi happens to hear, hey, the famine has lifted, there is food in Bethlehem. And she figures out, well, okay, I'm poor as dirt here in this country that is not my own. I might as well move back to my country and be poor as dirt in my country. I've got some land there. Who knows? So she picks up and leaves. And her daughters-in-law do what is expected of them in their society. They get up and they go with her because they're supposed to be loyal to her. Okay? But it's what we call in the social sciences a cultural script. It's sort of like if Roy gives me a rack of ribs, I'm supposed to say thank you, right? Okay? But I don't have to do anything more than that. I don't have to give them back to him. You know, in our culture, I don't have to bow to him like this, like you might do in Japan. I don't have to give him a gift in return, like you do in the Middle East. I just have to say, well, thank you, Roy. That was very thoughtful of you to bring me a rack of ribs. That's what we mean by a cultural script. It's something that everybody says, everybody in society knows, you're just supposed to do this in response to the other. Okay? So they're following a cultural script, and then Naomi does what she's supposed to do. She says, no, you go back to your people. Okay? Because she knows that she cannot care for them. She knows that in an ancient society, she is a woman. She cannot care for them. She cannot provide for them. So what does she do? She sends them home. Now, Orpah follows her mother-in-law's instructions. Orpah is not a villain here. She's just a young woman doing what her mother-in-law tells her to do. She's not a villain. Ruth is the one who does what is unexpected. That's where we get that beautiful, almost poetic response that Ruth gives to her mother-in-law. That's how you read it for us. Where you go is where I go. Where you live is where I live. Your people are going to be my people. Your gods, or your God in this case, is going to be my God. Wherever you die, that's where I'm going to die, and that's where I will be buried. I'm with you. And notice the translation, I think it's there in verse 17. Many of your translations may say, may God deal with me ever so severely if anything but death separates me from you. That's a big statement, isn't it? That's not actually how the New International Version translates it. That may not be what the Hebrew's actually saying. It may be saying, if anything, including death, separates me from you. That's a big statement. I'm with you. I'm not leaving you. Naomi capitulates. She allows her. But here's the thing. Naomi is still not encouraged. Her heart is still broken. She is still convinced that God is against her. So when they get back to Judah, when they get back home, Naomi's name means beautiful or pleasant. And she tells the women, don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter, because my life is bitterness. Naomi's heart is broken. And she is fully convinced that her life is over. What she doesn't realize is that God has already intervened on her behalf by bringing Ruth into her life. Now you got to understand, Ruth is moving back to this place that is not her own. It exposes her to a lot of risk. Sexual assault of women was very common in the ancient world. We don't know how common. There's no way to know. But it was very common. And there was no recourse for a woman who didn't have family members, male family members, to advocate for her. And she's taking this risk. She's moving back with her mother-in-law. And when they get there, it's not Naomi who goes out to the fields and looks for somebody to have mercy on them. It's Ruth. Ruth is the one who says to her mother-in-law, hey, let me go to the fields and see if I can find mercy in the eyes of someone today. And she goes. She's the one who makes the connection with Boaz. She's the one who does all the work of harvesting the grain. And Boaz recognizes that fact. And he instructs his workers, A, do not molest her. You should read that exactly the way it sounds. And not only that, pull out some stalks of grain for her. Give her extra food. He shows his chesed manifests itself in generosity. And that's what he does for her. Now, the story of chesed is not through, though. Because at the end of the harvest season, Ruth and Naomi have all the food that they need to last the winter. Who knows? Maybe they even have enough to plant in their own ground. But Naomi realizes, we can't keep going on this way. I need to figure something out. So she sends Ruth, and I'm going to leave out some of the details here because they're really interesting, but they're not exactly germane to our point. She sends Ruth to the threshing floor, and she teaches Ruth how to, shall we say, propose and proposition Boaz all at once. And he says yes. He says more than yes. He says, let me tell you something, girl. You are a woman of valor. That's not exactly how your translation will render it. It'll render it something like, you're a worthy woman, or you are a woman of noble characters, how the NIV translates it. But the word that's there, the adjective that's there, is the same adjective that is used for valiant warriors. You are a woman of valor, is what he says to her. And he says, this act of chesed is even more impressive than the one that you've already done. Because he says to her, look, you could have gone after anybody. You could have chased any guy that you wanted. You could have had any guy that you wanted. But you chose me to fulfill your obligations to your mother-in-law. But she did more than that. She was actually responding to his own chesed. And so he goes and takes care of things. He makes sure that all the arrangements are made legally. There's a whole bunch of legal stuff here that's sort of in the background. You don't see it in the story, but it's actually there. in the background. He goes and takes care of all of that. And the two of them are married. And Naomi, this woman who wanted to change her name from pleasant or beautiful to bitter, now has a grandson that she can call her own. She is no longer the one who is cursed by God. She is blessed because she has, as the text tells us, a daughter-in-law who loves her better than 7 sons. That's Hesed. That is the embodiment of Hesed. Now, there's some important features of Chesed that we learn from this story. Let's just pull them out and enumerate them real quickly, and then we'll kind of move to a place where we can apply this to our own lives. Okay? So, the first one we've already talked about. Chesed can be risky. It takes chances. It takes risks. Now, I'm not saying that we should take unnecessary risks. So we've talked about this before. In this church, we do not condone staying in an abusive relationship. I don't want to read about you on the news because your spouse or significant other killed you. And that's what often happens when abusive relationships are not ended. Okay? We're not talking about that kind of risk. But yes, Chesed does take risks. It takes chances. And sometimes those risks are dire indeed. Remember what we just said. Ruth is going back to a foreign country where she has no rights and no one to advocate for her. Women like that in the ancient world ended up in really difficult positions most often. But she took the risk on. Chesed most often involves sacrifice. Boaz alludes to that point when he's talking to Ruth. He says, look, you could have had a much younger guy. You could have had some guy, let's sort of paraphrase Boaz in our culture. You could have had some young stud who was rich and had big muscles. And, you could have had all of this. You could have had everything that you wanted. She could have. She was free. She wasn't around her father's family. They weren't there to arrange her marriage. She could marry whoever she wanted. But she made a sacrifice out of faithfulness to her mother-in-law. Chesed changes our perspective on what matters. We're going to come back to that in a moment. But Chesed changes our perspective on what's important, what matters, what should be valuable to us. There's nothing in this text that praises Ruth's beauty, though she may have been a looker for all we know. There's nothing in this text that praises her intelligence. There's nothing in this text that praises these other things. What Boaz points out, what the writer of the story points out over and over again, is her chesed. Those things that really matter. Those things that are about your character. Who you really are. Now, that is not to say that beauty or intelligence, giftedness, musical ability, it's not to say that those things are unimportant. They are good gifts of God. But let's see them for what they are, gifts of God. And let's remember that the most important thing is godly character. Okay? Now, Chesed is best when it is reciprocated and amplified. Notice the pattern we have here in Ruth. Ruth shows chesed to her mother-in-law by going and doing all this work in the field. Boaz recognizes that. And he shows chesed to her in return. Well, then she shows even more chesed back to him. Think about it this way, okay? Think about how human relationships work. If I am vulnerable to you, and I share with you some deep, dark part of my life, some part of me that is full of pain, or that shows my need, and you reward that by safeguarding that piece of vulnerability, I'm more likely to share with you again, right? I'm more likely to trust you. Likewise, if I show you that I care about you by sharing, and that I trust you by sharing some deep part of me with you, that's going to provoke in you the desire to share with me in return. We learn whether one another is safe by how we treat one another. So let's do the opposite. Let's say I tell you some deep, dark secret about me, something that's really hard, something that hurts me deep down inside. And I come back next week, and there's a billboard out here on Luke 254 announcing whatever it is that I told you. I'm probably never going to tell you anything again, right? I'm never going to share a deep part of myself. Even if I forgive you at some point, even if you come to me later and say, man, that was really stupid, I shouldn't have done that, I'm just not going to trust you. It's just human nature, right? So we want to demonstrate that we are people worthy of that kind of trust. But we also, and the way that we do that is not only by being open, vulnerable people, but by being faithful in the vulnerability of others. And finally, the final point that I want to pull out here is that chesed makes for healthy social systems. Whether it's a family, a church, a town, or a nation. Let's talk at that national level for a moment. One of the reasons that our society is so unhealthy is because we are not convinced that one another can be trusted. So when somebody disagrees with us, we assume they must be demonic. They must be evil. They must be terrible. Now, let me just be honest with you. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they are. But, you don't need to, when you see Ned the Nazi outside and he's got a swastika shaped into his head, you don't have to ask whether he's evil or not. He is. Just, move past that. Okay? But when we're talking with people, when we're getting to know people, it's hard because we assume that, you must be one of them. And we're always thinking in terms of us versus them. That's a terrible way to run a society. It is so hard to live that way. It's a terrible way to run a family. Some of you have seen families that work like that, right? Where there's so much mistrust, and frankly, sometimes that mistrust is earned. Because when you try to show faithfulness, loyalty, kindness, gentleness to them, they respond by turning it against you. That is so unhealthy. What we want are families and churches and communities where people genuinely love each other. where people genuinely care for each other. Where people genuinely recognize, hey, Pastor Wade is not perfect, but we're going to love him anyway. Yes, he eats too much. He'll steal your ribs. He'll, but we love him anyway. And we're not going to take advantage of his blindness to pickpocket him and take all his money, even if we need it. We're going to safeguard him. We're not going to let anybody else do that to him. By the way, that's part of doing justice, right? Like we talked about last week. How do you use your power? Do you use it to take advantage of people, or do you use it to protect people? You're going to be a wolf or a sheepdog? That's what we asked last week. This week, we're looking at these 5 things, and we're saying, okay, this is what chesed is. See how these things overlap? But in closing, we need to ask, okay, we know what chesed is now, but what does it mean to love chesed? Will you remember that third point that I made about valuing the right things? That's, Ruth teaches us what chesed is. Boaz teaches us what it means to love chesed, to see it, to value it. We live in a cynical culture, don't we? That's why I don't have a Twitter account, because that's the last thing I need is more cynicism in my life, right? Okay? We live in a cynical culture. People look at the kind of devotion that Ruth shows, and they're like, you're a chump. You're a sucker. You got to seize the day. But that's not what Boaz does. Boaz sees Ruth for what she is, a treasure to be valued and celebrated. That's what Micah 6:8 wants us to do. It doesn't just want us to show chesed. It wants us to value it in others. Now that can be a hard sell in our society. It can, and I understand why. We live in a tough world, don't we? But God is clear that this is what it means. This is what he requires of his people. And yeah, it's a journey. We have to work at it. We have to keep driving at it. But this is the way of life. This is the path to life. And this is what God calls us to. And as we walk this path, we learn to walk with God. And that's what we're going to talk about next week.